Hi, I'm Mandy Medley. I'm one of the worker owners here at Pilsen Community Books, which is a worker cooperative and independent bookstore in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And I am so excited to welcome you here tonight for a discussion with Jon Shelton and Cristina Groeger on Cristina's new book, The Education Trap, which is out this spring from Harvard University Press. A few notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce Cristina and Jon, and then they'll be in conversation, and then we'll have time for a short Q&A at the end of the talk. So if you have any questions at all during the event, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll make sure they're communicated at the appropriate time. Also, if our stream is interrupted due to spotty internet in Pilsen, just go to the Pilsen Community Books YouTube channel, and we'll start restreaming as soon as possible. Don't panic, we'll be back up soon. And also, I would be a terrible bookseller if I did not mention that you can buy The Education Trap and many other books on labor issues and education on our website at pilsencommunitybooks.com. And now, without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's guests. Jon Shelton teaches and does research on the past and present of working people, unions, jobs, and education in the United States. He is the author of Teacher Strike, Public Education and the Making of a New American Political Order, out in 2017, and the forthcoming book, The Rise and Fall of the Human Capital Myth. And Cristina Groeger is Assistant Professor of History at Lake Forest College. Her research has been funded by the National Academy of Education and the Spencer Foundation. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Jon and Cristina.
All right. Well, maybe I'll just start. Thanks so much to Pilsen for hosting this, and I want to just start by congratulating Tina on really just an incredible book. Here's my copy, and the things that I can show you is all of my notes inside. I'm going to get a different copy that I'm going to have Tina sign at someday when we can see each other in person. But I've just got pages and pages of notes because this book made me think about so many different things, and I think if when you buy this book, I'm assuming you're watching this, you're going to buy it. You're gonna find that it's going to make you rethink a lot of your own assumptions too. When I was reading it, I was really kind of reminded of there's a historian named Fernand Braudel who talked about the way he thought about history is, obviously you have important events that happen, right? And he kind of compared them to the stars. And he said, but there's this really important background, the kind of darkness. And what historians really need to do is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but sort of illuminate it, right? By looking at all of these people historically, who weren't the sort of like huge decision makers, right? Who weren't the people, declaring war and all those sorts of things. And, Tina's book really made me think about that because it's really this book that's about all of the individual choices that Americans in Boston, and we'll get into why Boston is important, I think, in a little bit, but all of the individual choices that Americans made about jobs and the kind of education that would get them to a certain job, and these it's a tremendous achievement. And I think where I would start, and maybe I can just get Tina to sort of help us get into the book this way. For decades, I think Americans have been told that education is the key to economic opportunity, and basically that this is how we make our society more equal, and that things have never been any other way. And I think Tina, your book really asks us to question that assumption in some really powerful ways. And so, again, this book centers on Boston, and it really kind of challenges those assumptions that we have by looking at late 19th and early 20th century, the late 19th and early 20th century labor market and the sphere of public education at a time when education reformers were seeking to help workers by upgrading their job skills, which sounds kind of familiar to today. So, I thought that might be a good place for us to start. I mean, Tina, do you want to just sort of tell us about your argument in the book and, what is this education trap, as you call it, and why should we pay attention to it historically?
Yeah, thank you, Jon. And also thank you to Pilsen Community Books and Mandy for hosting us here. So yeah, I mean, I think as Jon, as you said, there's this long tradition of viewing education as not just a means of social mobility, but as kind of a way of reducing social inequality. And it has been seen as a great equalizer since the 19th century. And yet, at the same time, in different periods in American history, including the present that we're living through right now, we're seeing sort of educational expansion. More and more people are being educated. And yet the US has one of the highest rates of social inequality, and inequality is going up, even though education is growing. So we have this sort of paradox, and I think that the early 20th century is a good place to look because it was also a period like our own where inequality was sort of, astronomical, and education was expanding very rapidly. And what I argue in the book is that, yes, education has always provided some people with a means of social mobility, and that has sort of given some real truth to the idea of education as a panacea for a range of social problems. But in this time period, which is really when we can say that education became really essential for accessing work across the employment structure, it also then became this new basis of inequality. And I look at different sectors of the labor market, but we can, and different, there's different dynamics in each. But I think in one way, education was actually used to try to undercut worker power. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about craft unions and sort of their role. And then also higher education was used by elites to really reconcentrate their power. So even though the educational system is expanding, at higher levels, educational credentials sort of became this new basis of elite reproduction. And the trap in the title is really about, if we put sort of all of our eggs in the education basket and have this faith that educational expansion will help us reduce inequality, I think we're missing how education actually has fueled inequality in many different ways. And the other takeaway from the book is that what matters more for inequality is actually the amount of power that workers have in the economy at large. And if they don't have that power, no amount of education can kind of bring that reduce inequality.
Yeah, that's great. So, tell us, how did you, there's so many things there, and we're going to unpack a few of those things, I hope. But how did you decide to study this? Why this question? Why education? Why Boston? Why this time period? How did this project evolve? How did you?
Idea is that education is really a way of transforming society as a whole, and particularly transforming the economy into really create a more equal and more democratic economy. And he's writing in this period in the early 20th century, and yet, inequality continued to rise. Education sort of didn't end up having this transformative effect in the American political economy. So when I started graduate school, one of the main questions, that I wanted to tackle in a dissertation was thinking about, why did Dewey's theory of education fail, or, what was going on? And I think I realized pretty quickly, in order to answer that question, I needed to look not just at education, but really what was happening in the economy and politics and in the labor market broadly. And also that education and labor market is researched much more outside of three departments. So economics, technology, political science, they all have various theories for understanding education and the economy. I think there's less of a well-developed tradition in history of that relationship. But at the same time, I think what history offers is, the full digging into the context, really being able to see how many of these theories and pieces what's happening. But what I try to do in the book is really put those together using some historical context. And Boston is a good place to look because it has a long, some of the oldest educational institutions, both public and private, and just sort of a very well-developed educational system. And it, in the time period that I'm looking at, it was in sort of economic ways more representative of other American cities. So a big commercial and industrial center, a large immigrant population, a lower percentage of African Americans, and that's I can talk more about sort of some of the regional differences in the U.S. And that made it a little bit distinctive. But a lot of that sort of ethnic politics of the city are similar to other American cities in the northern United States at this time. So it made it a good place to see, how education and the economy were interacting and changing over time.
Yeah, that's so important. And I know you and I have talked about this, but in other conversations. So Tina and I met because we were both postdoctoral fellows with the National Academy of Education, and I think we have kind of a similar approach to thinking about history, which is that, for I don't want to get too inside baseball here, but there's history and then there's history of education. And so history of education is like a separate field. It's often in education schools, whereas like history departments are often in, say a college of liberal arts and sciences, that kind of thing. And so oftentimes, one of the things that got me interested in this was in the stuff that I'm interested in is, seeing that those two fields weren't really connecting with each other, right? And so to your point, you would have economists talking about education, but historians really wouldn't touch it for a long. I mean, at least that's my feeling about the field. Is that sort of where, do you agree with that? Do you think that's sort of one of the things you're trying to do here too?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's still a divide, historians can get away with writing, economic histories and political histories, and education barely comes up. And I think that, there's a lot of great work now often from, historians of education that are really making the case you need education to explain urban history, urban development, to explain political economy. But yes, I think that that's sort of also a reflection of professionalization of schools of education that develop separately from sort of liberal arts colleges. But that has led to this disciplinary split that I don't think is very helpful in actually understanding what's going on.
Yeah, but you're right. I think books like yours, and some of the other scholarship that's out there, stuff like Ansley Erickson, Andrew Highsmith. I mean, they're basically, and you too are saying, no, we have to actually understand how education connects to all these things, and if we don't, it's not just about including it for its own sake. It's we're not getting the full story, right? And so
Right.
we have to get that. So just to go back quickly to Boston, I mean, you talked about a lot of the ways that Boston is representative. I mean, do you think, given, what you sort of, just said and what you argue in the book, I mean, given that Boston was sort of at the forefront of education access, I mean, in terms of both high school and the number of colleges and universities that are there, I mean, are there ways in which Boston is sort of more exceptional in this story, and how would we want to sort of account for that in thinking about, how your argument fits into the bigger kind of American story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the rates of education and enrollment are very high. And what's also unique is, I think, although this could be said probably of a lot of the East Coast, is just the powerful role of private institutions is something that kind of sets Boston apart, and New York, New York, other eastern cities, apart from some of the development of public universities in Western states. But in other ways, I think so. Like one of the main dynamics that is really important in driving a lot of what I talk about is the expansion of white collar work, and that sort of, people working as accountants and bookkeepers and secretaries and sort of all of the clerical, the paperwork that accompanies big corporate bureaucracies that are sort of exploding in this time period. And that is actually, this is a story that John Rury tells in some of his work on women in particular in education, that's an even more central story to Western states. So I think in thinking about, the drivers of the new economy, white collar work is really central both in Boston and is also kind of a national story. And that's sort of the piece of changing in education, the success women able to use public high schools, a number of other kinds of private commercial colleges and commercial schools, but basically a whole new types of educational institutions to access this, booming sector of work. But that is, of course, like part of a set of broader transformations that not everyone is able to benefit from.
Right. So there are these, and we'll maybe get back to this in a little bit, but there are some at least qualified successes for folks going into the labor markets and being able to sort of access new skills that do actually pay off in getting better jobs.
Yeah, I think, and so what's interesting, I think, about white collar work is that we educational historians talk about the early 20th century as the high school movement. So this is a period of like huge public high school growth. And what I found is that in Boston and other cities, first before there are high schools, there's a lot of basically private, for-profit colleges of the 19th century that were often called business or commercial colleges, but they were some of the first schools that were offering training that was relevant for becoming a stenographer, right, who took shorthand, or a typist, or someone who had to have good penmanship. And basically the public, there's a broad constituency that really wants to have this kind of training that's opening up opportunities, and public officials are interested in getting students to move out of these, what they see as sort of exploitative for-profit schools, and into the public school system. Existing universities also feel a little threatened by some of these upstart, for-profit colleges. So I kind of argue that the high school movement is kind of was motivated in part to displace this for-profit sector, which has important, I think, implications for how we think about, what is the best way to combat for-profit education in the present. But in any case, I think in this case, we can only understand the huge expansion of education as basically vocational training for white collar work in this period. And of course, there are other, many people were talking about citizenship and Americanization and other kinds of goals for education in this time period. But looking at, how did it actually connect to the labor market, that I think helps us explain when and why it actually grew and got such high enrollment when it did.
Right. That's fascinating. So since we're sort of on that topic, let's take a step back, if we could. And I mean, one of the things I found fascinating about just the first couple of chapters, I think it's mainly the first chapter. So your book really starts in about 1880, and you start off by talking about how it is that people in Boston found jobs in like the sort of last 20 years of the 19th century. And I would bet that just about everybody who's watching this would be surprised at how most Bostonians found jobs at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, and it was a fun chapter to write, and also one I think that shows us why history is important, right? We can enter into a very different world. But yes, I mean, schools were really marginal to the labor market, and most people did not go to school beyond 8th grade. So in the first chapter, I sort of trace, for the labor market is still extremely divided, and not just by class and occupation, but gender is the structure of the women's labor market is completely different from men, and also very segregated by race and ethnicity. But for recent immigrants, finding work entailed basically connections with family, with kinship networks, with ethnic networks, and walking on the job and becoming a street paver. Or for craft work, it often entailed having a family connection to someone who was already a craft worker, so that they could set you up with an apprenticeship and you would basically learn your work on the job. And even for white collar work and the professions, like what we think of as the learned professions and associate with like long periods of schooling, even for a lot of those jobs, you would have to have a connection already with a merchant, with a lawyer, right, to sort of work in their office as also sort of an informal apprentice. And most professionals did not attend a specialized professional school. I mean, professionals often had some higher college education, but they did not. But they learned their actual profession, alongside another practitioner, not in a professional school. So I sort of emphasized, like, the labor market was very unequal in some ways. It was extremely divided, but there were not formal pathways into work and formal training in the way that now, we sort of assume that schooling plays that formal training role.
Right. I mean, yeah, that first chapter is just fascinating for all the reasons you just outlined. I'm sorry, my son keeps calling me, and he doesn't realize that when I decline the call, it means like stop calling me. I literally had to turn my phone off. He's with his grandparents, so he's fine. There's not an emergency or anything. Okay, so then the next question is, how did that change? I mean, what changed to then lead to this sort of, I mean, there were still people in the early 20th century finding jobs in that way, but what were some of the things that changed that then led people to, increasingly seek educational credentials?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so one of the stories that I already talked about was sort of changes in white collar work, and that is really the important for craft union control, and one of the ways that craft unions have some power in the workforce. So employers have a big incentive to try to find other cheaper ways of training their workers instead of relying on a craft union apprenticeship process. And so employers are very interested in new kinds of schools, private trade schools, other kinds of industrial education that they hope will allow them to sort of circumvent the union apprenticeship process. In this case, and I talk as much about sort of failures in educational attempts as some of the successes, but in the case of craft work, I think this is a good example of a failure of the attempt to try to structure access to work through education, because craft unions are actually pretty effective at shutting down some of these trade schools. Like their craft work is the only, semi-unionized sector of the labor market, and workers have some real power in that sector. So they're able to limit the success of these industrial education programs. And in response, employers then pursue another strategy, which is essentially to try to just shift their entire workforce away from craft workers and find entirely different kinds of workers to staff big industries, mass production industries, and their large bureaucracies. And so, like, one of the changes that's both a labor market change and a change in the expansion of education is essentially the move, craft work declining in this period as say, like, immigrant factory operatives that can be trained very quickly and maybe have, a primary school education, and then this new group of high school educated white collar workers, they become, the biggest sectors of work in this period, but they are also workers with far less power than craft workers. So employers, from the employer's perspective, the expansion of schooling, the shift to a more educated workforce also means a shift to a far less powerful and more kind of contingent workforce that gives them a real advantage, kind of, and helps concentrate employer power. So yeah, that's one of the big shifts in, a sort of strategy for using education that doesn't quite work, but then has really important consequences for changes in the political economy overall.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that many of these changes in the labor market essentially happened because employers were looking to find cheaper sources of labor, which I think, we clearly haven't moved very far from that from that struggle now. I mean, I think about, this whole debate over unemployment benefits and extended unemployment benefits, and one of the things we hear a lot in Wisconsin is that there's a so-called shortage of workers, and so we do everything other than just pay workers more money, right? I mean, like we try to find new ways to give working people job skills. And I mean, the whole thing here is like, it's, at least in Green Bay in particular, is we've got to have more engineers and we've got to have more people who can do these sort of, skilled jobs. But the reality is people aren't going into them for the most part, except for, ironically, as you point out toward the end of the book, ironically, it's those that are still unionized are the ones that the trades that people will still go into. But it's that these employers, they want workers, but they want them on their own terms, right? And they want them as cheaply as possible. And so it seems like this is kind of the moment when we see the very origins of that, right?
Yeah, no, and this gets to sort of the idea of human capital, which is not used sort of in that way, or talked about explicitly in the early 20th century, but I think, right, we can see employers sort of seeing schools as a progressive reformers, education reformers in this time. They begin to view education as one of the best ways of addressing poverty, because of sort of the idea that, if, workers that are not receiving high wages they're not getting high wages because they're not skilled enough. So if only we impart more skills, this is going to allow workers to access higher wages, and they will be compensated better in the labor market. And this, I also talk about sort of some of the failures of reformers' efforts to try to use this for different low-wage jobs, including domestic service. And this is sort of the origin of home economics as a field, but basically imagining that, like, if you can train better, that field starts with sort of this reform project to say, if you can train domestic workers to be more skilled, then that will turn domestic service into a profession. And they use that language, modeled on what was happening in an entirely different, sector of the labor market that had really different dynamics going on. But, and they try to launch schools of housekeeping that also fall flat. So I think the pervasive idea, though, I mean, and again, this this human capital assumption, I think, of higher skills equals higher wages is disproven repeatedly in the labor market. But because of some of the successes in white collar work and in other sectors, it still has really important lasting power. Even though it cannot, say, overcome job discrimination, that keep African Americans, despite what I found in Boston, which is actually, they have higher levels, African Americans have higher levels of education than working class white students. They were almost entirely excluded from white collar work. So just the idea that more skills equals higher wages is constantly disproven. But I think because it's such a useful fiction for employers to keep up, we see the skills shortage, calls for more training repeated again and again throughout our history.
Yeah, and that discussion of domestic workers and the kind of training programs, I mean, that was just fascinating because, what you basically show is the problem was the jobs were horrible, right? And
Right.
women voted with their feet, and the minute that they could get out of those jobs because they were effectively live-in help, and they had to, they worked in these very restrictive sorts of environments. And, there was nothing you could do to professionalize that sort of situation, but there were these fantasies that you could, I mean, really fantasies, I think, right?
Yeah.
So since you brought up African American workers, this is a place I wanted to go, and I want to kind of tie this in with, the way that you talked about trade unions and, specifically the ways that, unions of the trades, were able to sort of control access to the labor market, right? Now, on the one hand, that sounds like you're giving workers labor power. On the other hand, it's also a way that you can restrict some people from entering the labor market. So, and explicitly, I'll just say what I mean explicitly, African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, do you think that, and this is not a loaded question, I'm legitimately asking this question. I mean, but do you think we romanticize trade unions sometimes when we think about their ability to, and I'm not saying you, I'm saying we as, when we sort of, as labor historians, when we think about, their ability to access, or, to restrict access to the labor market, do you think we do that sometimes?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think here it really matters. There are different types of unions and different models of unions. And I think the craft union model, I think there's plenty of romanticization of craft unions in the 19th century too. But I think it is very important to see, how their power was also premised on exclusion, right? Like their power came from limiting access to who could perform. The beginning of industrial unions, which are unions that mostly organized outside of the trades, but in fields like the garment industry. There were some service worker unions and laborers unions that were that started in the early 20th century, where essentially, they didn't often have access to a specialized craft skill that's also in some ways like similar to sort of a professional association, guarding access to a certain skill. Their solidarity and their power came from organizing across a really broad group of workers across lines of gender and race and ethnicity. And that became the basis of union power in the middle of the 20th century in organizations and unions like the CIO that I think are a more promising model, right, to learn from in the present. And I mean, I think, now we're facing the decimation of the labor movement and really low unionization rates. But I think the fact that unions have offered one of the few ways that workers can exert real power in the workplace and up against sort of the power of employers means that they're going to have to be really important in any strategy moving forward. But I think there are better models than a lot of the ones that I talk about in the book as what that kind of solidarity could look like. And I think we're seeing some of that in teachers unions and healthcare workers unions, some of the more broader based types of solidarity in the union movement.
No, I think that's extremely well put, and really appreciate the level of complication with what you're talking about. That I mean, this, people watching this might not know, but I'm a proud union member and of a AFT local, and it seems like every year on Labor Day I do like a Wisconsin Public Radio segment where we talk about whatever the kind of state of the unions are. And there's always one person who calls in. It's almost always a guy who's like, I was in a union and it didn't do anything for me. And I'm like, well, yeah, but there's lots of different kinds of unions. Unions, as you're describing, they're social institutions. They have different, they have different ways of operating depending on what kind of union they are. They have different leaders who are elected, right? And so, thinking very kind of carefully about, what are some of these models that we can draw on as we're thinking about really, how unions connect to this question of education and jobs and political economy is so important. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure we get to this. You conclude the last chapter in the book is really just a fascinating exploration of how elites in Boston used education, right? So this is after decades of reform or reform efforts, how they use education, especially university educations, to continue to ensure their own economic privilege. So I'm wondering if you could, sort of explain to us how that worked and why that's an important thing for us to pay attention to.
Yeah. So what we can see happening, kind of looking across the economy, is that in reaction to, or this is how I make sense of it, in reaction to the expansion of public high schools, right, that turn high school from a fairly marginal and also elite activity into sort of a mass institution, as well as the feminization of a lot of white collar work that had been exclusively male beforehand, and the entry of immigrants into new jobs. We see, basically a reaction among elites who are both trying to preserve their economic power. Traditional elites in Boston are also kind of losing their strength in comparison to New York as a financial center, to Western states where some of the largest mass production industries are taking place. So, and thinking about, in after waves of immigrants coming into Boston, are looking for ways of basically continuing to distinguish themselves and maintain their power. And I think higher education, and specifically private colleges and universities in Boston, become a really useful tool for them to do so, because they can gain the kind of, like, business leaders can gain the prestige and the association with expertise that universities are starting to really offer. And universities are also looking basically for ways of expanding their enrollments and staying relevant in the new economy and continuing to get contributions through their alumni networks. So it's this very sort of useful marriage between universities and new elites. And in the last chapter of the book, it's a sort of a gold mine of like an archival find, but basically I found records from the Harvard University Placement Office, which basically was, their career advancement center, or colleges call them different things now, but essentially the office that would help college graduates find employment, and most college graduates in this period are now going into business and sort of business management positions. And you see, very explicitly in the correspondence between employers and these administrators, the fact that they are looking for extracurricular activities and personality traits, and also, often very explicit about looking for Protestants only or looking for white graduates only. And so what I argue is that, although from the outside it looks as though college graduates are being rewarded because of their academic merit with access to some of the highest paying jobs in the economy at this time, if we sort of look behind the scenes, we basically see the reproduction and the making of the old boys network, right? That continues in many ways to operate in some of these elite institutions. But it's now under the guise of a academic credential or under the guise of sort of a meritocracy. And that's a way that I think one of the strongest ways that education becomes this new basis of inequality, because it basically sort of erases or gives this illusion of merit to some of the trends that are really shaping who has access to these jobs.
Yeah, and that makes me think, and I really like the way you sort of connected that to our current moment, because I'm sure people following this have heard of things like the Bernie Sanders and who did he co-sponsor it with? The College for All Act. It was co-sponsored.
Jayapal?
Jayapal, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I support that, right? I totally support that bill. I support the idea of a tuition-free future. But, I think since we have these, basically networks that are going to continue to replicate this inequality, that by itself is not likely to move the needle all that substantially, the economic, inequality that exists in this country. So we're starting to get some questions in from the chat, but I want to end on this one. Okay, this is going to be my last question. So this is a nice transition, I think, from that last point we were talking about. What do you think should be the purpose of education in a democratic society? So if you had a magic wand and you could change our education and labor markets to be more equitable, what would you do? I know that's a huge question.
Yeah. So first I'll say, one of the big arguments of the book is that we need to get beyond just looking at education. We need to focus on basically how we can increase worker power in the economy. And we can't do that through education. We have to basically do that through other forms of workplace organizing, through other kinds of legislation that can, tax the rich, raise the minimum wage, other kinds, create public jobs, other kinds of interventions that are much more directly about creating well-paying jobs. And I think for me, it's sort of, until we can address the real economic concerns that many students have, and justifiably so, that they are concerned about getting a job when they graduate. And they see education as a tool of doing that many academics, will lament, the vocationalization of education, or sort of the vocational, how students are pursuing this careerism that we wish they didn't have to. But it's sort of until they can get a job and have a good job at the other end, we can't free up the education system to do anything else. And it's totally first, then that would free up education to actually do other kinds of things. And then we could have a whole discussion, about what in an ideal society, what would education provide? And I think there it's things more like creativity and self-discovery and, all the things that I think many of us would want education to be about, but can't be or is so limited because of these economic limits that are set. But I'll also say, in thinking about this question of what could education be in the future, I think we can also think about education really broadly and not just thinking about it as something that takes place in a classroom, but thinking about, an organizing campaign or a political campaign or students leading protests or working with their teachers when their teachers go on strike. All of those forms of all of those experiences are also educational experiences. And I think in some of them, we really do see, that's how people are learning what it means to engage in a democracy, to sort of build power for working people. So my ideal form of education would be much more of that sort of practical, political organizing work that I think, we can see happening in many different contexts, not just within schools. Although I think because education is such a big sector of the labor market now, we see education as being one place where a lot of that is happening in the present.
Yeah, I really appreciate the nuance of that answer. In a lot of ways, we're back to Dewey, kind of actually, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
But
it ends up going back to that.
But I feel like there's a growing group of scholars who are saying education's not the answer, right? And one of my frustrations is because I make the same argument. I've got a friend up here at UW River Falls who's making a lot of this, he's sort of making these great arguments, particularly about sort of what education reformers are trying to do in the past 20 or 30 years. His name's Neil Krauss. He's a political scientist. But what you get a lot of times, and Neil and I always talk about this, is what you get is well, so are you anti-education? And it's no, I'm not anti-education, but we can't, that's not going to fix our problems. We got to focus on all these other things first, and then we'll have that conversation. And so I think, I wish I could kind of bottle that answer and just give it myself, because I feel like I get it all the time, that question. All right. So this has been tremendously interesting, and we've got some questions in the chat to follow up on. So I'll just read this one. So the first question is, how does the PRO Act relate to this important history, and does it have the potential to break down some of these occupational hierarchies that you talk about?
Yeah, I think things like the PRO Act could really help combat the decline and the fact that it's so hard to organize, and there are so much of labor law is on the side of employers, and employers can basically get away with whatever they want, kind of with a vengeance. So our current landscape, economic and legal and political, is so stacked against new kinds of organizing or efforts to organize that we saw in the recent Amazon drive, that I think we really do need much, protections and meaningful legislation that can make it much easier to organize unions. And I think the PRO Act is definitely a good step in that direction. I don't know if that alone will transform the labor movement. I think that's sort of a complicated, there's many facets of that, but I think just because it's so hard to organize a union now, any legislation that can around it is a really good way to also then talk about why does the labor movement matter? Why does worker power matter? And that, I think, that we can see historically in the middle of the 20th century. I think the power of unions and the power of organized workers was really the main reason that inequality actually went down. And so economists like to think it was, or talk about how it was education that reduced inequality, but I think a lot of the evidence shows how basically like level of unionization and inequality are very closely connected in our history.
Yeah, actually, so when I was thinking about questions, so the economists, for those of you watching this, that Tina's referencing are two economists named Golden and Katz. I mean, there's others, but they wrote this sort of famous book that makes this argument, and it's just they're very smart, but it's a maddening book actually, because it makes this sort of like, really kind of structural argument that it's as long as you can have the increase in education outpace the increase in technology, we're going to be fine. And you think about those Amazon workers, would they be better off having the PRO Act, or would they be better off having, as much as I love the idea, if you could pick one of the two, the PRO Act or the College for All Act, and it would clearly be the PRO Act, right? Because it would immediately sort of impact their lives. So yeah. All right. Well, here's another question. When we talk about independent working class power, is there any history of unions organizing and running their own primary or secondary schools for working class children?
Good question. There's actually you should check out a great book by Toby Higbee about sort of the history of working class and labor education. But yes, I mean, well, so what I see in the early 20th century, and I know there is a longer history of this, that especially in the 1960s, I think in other forms, but I know mostly about the early 20th century. And yes, there's a whole range of worker colleges that are largely founded to, I mean, they basically present themselves as, we're offering higher education and knowledge for working people, and it's not going to be controlled by private interests. It's not going to be beholden to philanthropists that were donating to colleges at this time. It is going to be sort of worker operated institutions, and most of these institutions end up training, they're small for the most part. In Boston, the Boston Trade Union College actually just sort of it operates like within existing public high school buildings in the evenings. So it's not a school in the physical, maybe traditional sense we would think about it. But a lot of these schools end up training sort of future trade union leaders, and I think we can say like they never become mass institutions just because unions do not have the resources to do that in the way that public schools sort of became mass institutions, but they do offer really important education, a lot of labor history and political economy. I think programs that still exist now within universities, like at UMass Amherst and UMass Boston, that have labor resource centers. I think, those are carrying on that tradition. And primary and secondary schools, I don't actually know if there were specific ones. So that would be a question maybe for Toby. But there were these colleges, and the idea too was really to just make forms of knowledge that were only accessible to the elite in existing colleges at the time, like available to anyone that wanted to access them. So they had a very democratic and kind of class-based or for
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I would add to that is, in for say primary schools, you didn't. I don't know of any of like worker-led schools, but one of the interesting things about like the moment that you're writing about in Tina, in Boston, is like in Chicago, you had a teacher union movement that was largely comprised of working class women, like people like Margaret Haley, and they were definitely bringing that right into the public schools.
Right.
So you don't have the schools, right? But part of that, I think, is because, you've, at least in some places in the United States, you have a level of sort of openness to, or at least breaking down the door maybe to resistance, of working class organization. It's not everywhere, but you do have some examples of that. So.
Yeah, and actually, just on that, I also want to add that I think, we were talking about sort of the interest behind public education, and right, we talked about how employers have their own particular interests and what they want to get out of education. But I think what we also maybe, and here's where I'm like pushing back a little bit on some Marxist historians that view education as sort of top-down control, shaping minds, right, of future factory workers. I think actually, like, public education expanded and was so successful because it had real working class support. And so in a lot of ways, although there was often class and status differences between students and teachers, and certainly them and administrators, I think public institutions, public primary and secondary schools, often really did reflect the interests of at least a large majority of working class people, especially as primary and secondary schools became mass institutions that like working class parents would send their kids to. So.
Yeah. All right, let's maybe make this the last one so we can keep this to an hour. So could you speak more to the overall scarcity of high quality jobs and the breakage between what is logical at an individual level in terms of education attainment, but less so systematically?
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, I think okay, we have to recognize that at an individual level, in the present, school and formal education and college education now really does matter for accessing the limited number of well-paying jobs. And so of course, education as an individual strategy is not something we can just say, I tell this long history, now we can just walk away from education as if it didn't sort of have that effect. I think the problem is that as a systemic reform, just increasing the number of people or expanding access to education and encouraging everyone to get more and more education, that to me, that sort of is only going to drive forward some of the same processes that we see happening throughout our history, where essentially with every new, if it wasn't high school education that was exclusive enough, then it was college education. If it's not college, now it's going to be a master's or a professional degree, right? So elites are very good at creating new barriers to entry in terms of accessing higher paying jobs. And so we could simply be driving forward this kind of credentials race if more education is kind of the only solution. And I think that's really dangerous at a time like now with really high inequality, and also when worker power is at an all-time low, because it means that the number of well-paying jobs at the top is basically is small and is not expanding, and if anything is sort of going to shrink. And so just sending more and more people to kind of fight over a very small number of jobs at the top, that's not going to address the larger problem of everybody needing a well-paying job at the end of their educational career. So, and if workers don't have other ways of changing of creating well-paying jobs at the end of it, then I think more education could really just exacerbate that inequality and become yet further a tool for economics to concentrate their power. So I think it's especially at a time like now, unless we can find ways of trying to create well-paying jobs, and I think to do that we need to find strategies of increasing worker power, education is alone, I think, is in some ways, it's this trap idea. It's sort of a dangerous solution because it can just exacerbate the same trends that sort of are shaping our economy and our educational system now.
I think that is a terrific spot to conclude this conversation. I hope everybody else has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Thank you, Tina. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and
thank you.
The book is right here. Make sure to buy it at Pills and Books. And Mandy, I don't know if you want to conclude with any final greetings.
Yeah, thank you both so much for agreeing to do this tonight. It's been really, really great and totally in line with what we're about here at Pilsen Community Books. And also thank you to everyone who dealt with if there's any lag in internet. It was really great. And yeah, you can pick up Christina's book on our website, pillscommunitybooks.com, or any other independent retailer. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Great. Thanks everybody. And thank you, Jon.
It's fun.
for reading and engaging.
My pleasure.
Thanks.